Okay, we are here for the 5th installment of the All Things Facades podcast, and this episode is going to be all about forensics and existing facades in existing buildings. So we have Hannah and Raul. I'm going to give you both a chance to introduce yourselves, but I actually just learned 2 minutes ago that you guys are married, which makes this dynamic very interesting. So it'll be good for maybe Hannah, you could start, and then Raul, just a quick 60 seconds each on your background. And then what I really want to know is, were you guys married before or after the business started?
Good question. So I come from a family of contractors, and my dad's an architect. But in my schooling, and coincidentally, I managed to work for somebody that used Revit back before Autodesk owned it. So in my career, I just sort of ended up capitalizing on that and becoming a BIM manager at some of the larger firms in New York City. And this whole technology and data-driven design really I loved it. It fascinated me. I got into laser scanning, Revit modeling, and everything, and the things that you can do with prefabrication, panelization of systems, how you can build these crazy things that star architects design, but then they don't know how to do it. So that was my experience. And then we met in school. We met in grad school. We survived grad school together, got married, and then worked separately for I think maybe 10 years, where Raul worked in facades and restoration, so he can talk about that more. And I worked on the BIM side of things, and we would see each other working on our separate careers and see these things really should be happening together. And the frustration that he didn't have a company that wanted to do laser scanning that he worked at, and I just nerded out on making really cool 3D models. So then that's what happened for us to grow the business at a certain point.
And Raul, your forensic building experience, that comes from the Florida market?
So yes, thanks for the question. I'm Raul Mayta. I'm the founder and principal architect at M+S. My background comes from industrial engineering. I'm originally from Peru. And then I have some civil engineering experience in Florida, that's where we met. I met Hannah on grad school, and we're moving to New York. All my forensic experience is based in New York, actually. I've been practicing in New York for the last 13, 14 years.
Okay, so I guess I really want the premise of this conversation to spread awareness and have people understand why there's so much scrutiny and attention paid towards existing buildings in New York. I come from the unitized curtain wall, window wall background, but now that I'm in window replacement, there's very few markets in this country, at least stateside, that put so much attention into their existing buildings. And even one like Boston, which considering all the institutions, spends a lot of money on their existing infrastructure, none have really the scrutiny and liability that you see around New York. So especially when it comes to something like FISP, Facade Inspection Safety Program, and Local Law 11, what really triggered that, and how long has it really been around at a focal point of business?
So that's a good question. FISP was initially started as Local Law 10 in 1980. And what happened is that a piece of a building in Manhattan collapsed and unfortunately killed a student from Barnard College. After that, this happened in 1979. In 1980, Mayor Ed Koch decided to pass a regulation in which every building taller than 6 stories had to be inspected. With time, the Local Law 10 developed into Local Law 11 on 1998. Few changes happened. It became more strict, and then that has developed, to what we have now. It's now called FISP since 2016, Facade Inspection Safety Program, which have also included new regulations for railings inspections, cavity walls, and a greater number of scaffold reviews. So what's happening and why it's developing is because our city is aging, right? New York is one of those places that have a combination of different materials, tall buildings, right? FISP it's applicable to taller buildings, and then the weather, right? Mother Nature, it's wise, but it's also brutal with our materials. We have a combination of glass, wood, terracotta, brick, and these materials have been in some of our buildings for over 100 years, and they're aging, and they're unfortunately, they're aging and they're breaking apart. So they do need to be inspected. So what became as an accident in 1979, it has been happening every year. Every year we get it in the news. There is a new collapse. There was a collapse 2 years ago near Times Square. That there was a collapse in 57th Street that triggered the regulations for railings. Right, a lady fell down while she was on her balcony. She leaned on her railing. The railing, gave up. So that changed the rule. So, and I think the rule is going to continue changing. It's changing every 2 years almost as the city develops, as new materials get integrated into our fabric. We foresee that FISP will continue to develop.
So Hannah really goes into the technology side of things, but obviously we're talking about 1979, and at that time that wasn't exactly applicable. So what did those initial inspections, forensic studies look like? And was it on certain buildings of a certain height or buildings built in a certain era?
Yes, so back in the initial inspections were mainly visual. They were completely different. Right now, so basically they require, I'm sure there were more simple reports. The inspections were mainly visual, and they were focused on buildings that had or sections of the buildings that were facing the street. Right now, FISP has evolved on any section of your building that is greater than 6 stories. And it doesn't matter if it's facing the street or if it's on the back. Wherever people who could access the building, there could be a potential that some section of the building could collapse. So yes, initially it seems to be it was just something as simple as a visual review with binoculars from the street, from the roof, and then it became into, okay, so now we need to address other sections of the building. We don't need only binoculars, we need to do hands-on inspections, because there is a limit of what you can see from the street, from the roof, and then this may change when you start touching the materials, when you start sounding the materials. So with time, with the evolution of FISP, the Department of Buildings require close-up inspections where the QA has to actually go up from the floor all the way to the tallest section of the building and touch the materials. Initially, it was one drop. Now it's like one drop for the facade. Now they require one drop every 60 feet of facade. So even with binoculars,
what were some things that you were looking at? And I'm guessing we're talking about stuff like stone, terracotta, hand-laid brick. What were things you were looking for, like crack propagation and monitoring it over time?
Right. So there's a lot you can see with binoculars. Yes, you will see cracks. You will understand why the cracks are happening, or you could see signs of movement, shifting, inclination of some building elements. So there is a broken glass, things that are about to spoiling segments. So I think it was fairly basic, but it's a good understanding. The disadvantage of that is that you could only see it from two perspectives, right? Probably from the street and from the roof or a neighboring building. So you had a lot of blind spots, right? Because of the angles and protrusions. So it's possible that you were not able to see the top of a balcony or the top of a water table. So it is great that now with technology, things like implementation with drones are becoming more common, because it will really allows us to have more comprehensive understanding of what the building is traveling with.
Well, I'm really, in my head, I'm envisioning sort of pre-war buildings that are under a lot of scrutiny. But the funny thing is, when unitized curtain wall became commonplace in the 60s and 70s, you build a building, all of a sudden, after 5 years, that has to comply with local law 11. So the minute it's turned over, it's an existing building. And so when we talk about especially structurally glazed curtain wall, these aluminum framing members, 30, 40, 50 years, I don't know, you think about the lifespan of sealant, gaskets, insulated glass units. It's a different side of the industry that a lot of people don't think about. I think a lot of people just envision a piece of stone or terracotta or brick falling out, but there's a lot of attention that needs to be placed around these structurally glazed systems.
It's interesting. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Anna.
I was going to say it's interesting because we come across that a lot with our clients because they have this sort of in this vision that it's a new building, right? So what could go wrong? And I think from the safety aspect, you're looking at things like broken glass and things that can fall. But what we found more often our involvement in one of these types of curtain wall system buildings is actually leak issues, because they're almost, I feel like now, you know, we're like almost 50 years into it. People understand the systems more, but a lot of those systems built back in the 70s and 80s, it was new technology, and there wasn't really an understanding of how is this sealant going to perform in the weather and the freeze thaw, if it's by salt water and things like that. So we get called oftentimes for FISP because it's the law, but then when you're there, you ask, like, the first thing we do is ask for a leak report, right? And they don't think it's related because FISP is related to safety, but then when you start investigating all these leaks and everything, you start seeing the failures of the systems and where it's affecting the building occupants, not as much the street level pedestrian, but it is making these buildings unhealthy. There's mold, there's moisture infiltration issues. And it's unfortunate because the clients think, oh, it's a new building, everything is fine. But in fact, these new technologies at the time were unknown. And so it's an interesting learning process to see how that progresses over time.
When it comes to glass treatment, how much do your clients worry about spontaneous glass breakage, whether it's through thermal stress or nickel sulfide inclusion? I mean, it's something that might not be able to be easily detected early on. So they have some type of incident on a facade that's street facing, and then they think, oh my God, could this be, a uniform problem throughout my facade?
Yes. So unfortunately, when it does happen, when it happens, it's treated as a individual case scenario, right? Like, okay, let's replace this section instead of looking at the entire facade and understanding what is it happening. Part of it is like lack of records that the buildings may have, and understanding of what was put into the building. But so it is limited. It has been reported in some projects that there is breakage of glass. Part of it may be the installation, the wrong specifications, but it's unfortunately most of the time with a lot of the forensic industry treated as one case scenario, one case incident, instead of looking at the entire component and the entire installation or assembly of the facade system.
So how do you explain to people who aren't in the city when they come and visit how half the city is filled with sidewalk sheds?
Well, this is a great question. As Hannah mentioned, when we started, we moved from Florida to New York, and when we arrived, I remember my first boss said, we started working on 2008, which was clearly like the worst time to start working in architecture, right? But my first employer said, do you see how many sheds there are on the street? That's how many potential projects there are, because there's so many, right? The city, in the recent report, estimated there's about 400 miles of sidewalk sheds.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we explain to the client as well, or anyone coming? It is a little difficult. I mean, it seems like that the city is failing, right? Like the city is unfortunately failing. Is it extreme to put a sidewalk shed right away? That's something that is there's a controversy that it's a discussion that is happening right now. The city is talking about looking into alternative methods of protection. If you go to other places in Europe, you don't see the amount of shed, right? The shed seems to be like, okay, like some system that you put once you're ready to do the work. But in the meantime, you could put netting, you could block access, you could have fencing. So those are new systems that the city is now thankfully considering. As you may have heard about the program that the mayor is trying to explore about getting the sheds down, right? So as part of that program, they are exploring options for netting, and they're trying to make these sheds also more attractive. There is actually a competition for open where they're trying to incorporate art into the sheds, or they're trying to make some new designs. There is some companies trying to make them more attractive. So I think there is a great significant amount of shed in New York that could probably be reduced with alternative methods. It is an obstruction, definitely. It's nothing pleasant. Clients complain all the time, not only because of the cost associated with sheds, but because of the social aspects that happen under the shed, right? There is like security concerns. It affects the commerce. The commercial buildings definitely get affected by it. So it's something that no one really desires, but unfortunately it's like the go-to method of protection in the industry. And this is something that is being reviewed, thankfully.
Well, I guess two questions. A, in terms of ease of access to actually monitor or gain access to the exterior. If every 5 years you have to put up that shed, and if you're doing periodic remedial work on the facade, but also how do you explain to people how if a facade is deemed unsafe, you technically have to have that sidewalk shed in place?
Well, that's what's happening in a lot of the scenarios, is that it's interesting when you talk to people who are not in the industry, they don't realize that, like they don't really know why there's sheds there. They don't know that that shed is like potentially saving your life. But it's unfortunate because it is, as soon as you see something unsafe, that's the first thing that you have to tell your client. You have to say, you need to protect the public, because then to be at the most baseline level, if you don't protect the public, that's a violation that you get from the building department. It's not just you get failure to maintain and you get failure to protect the public. So it's very important, but I think that's a little bit of part of the problem, because there's not necessarily an expedited way to solve the problem. Just put the protection, and then if the building, for example, doesn't have the budget to do the repairs that they need, that shed could be there indefinitely currently. You have to keep paying for the rental of the shed. You have to keep renewing the permit, but it could just exist there, and that's just the solution. And it's not going to actually fix the problem. The building can continue deteriorating and fall over. In the case of like the Bronx, for example, it's like they had a shed there. They didn't take care of the problem, but that's the point of the get sheds down, because it's actually going to, at a certain point, they're still establishing the penalties, but they're going to at a certain point start penalizing the owners for not getting the sheds down. And the way to get the sheds down is to do the repairs. So when you're talking to a building owner who you just told them, as we like to think of ourselves as building doctors, but like sometimes the doctor tells you have to go get chemotherapy, and you're like, I really don't want to. I know that I have to, but I really don't have the money for this, or whatever. So the sheds is the solution. But it needs, there needs to be a way to help incentivize the owners to fix the problem.
Well, I have two questions from that. A, is there a fine that an owner can pay if their facade is deemed unsafe and just sort of neglect or push aside the structural issue at hand?
In a way, you have to file extensions basically every 90 days until the work is done. It's up to the DOB's discretion to approve or deny those extensions. So if you just said no work has happened, they could not approve the extension, and then they can do the failure to maintain penalties. But the way that it's set up right now is just kind of, if you would rather spend your money just slowly extending these reports and everything, you could. At a certain point, you're going to run into the next filing cycle, right? So you've got 5 years for every filing cycle. So then you would have to file a subsequent or amended report. And at that point, you really would need to be getting these repairs done. But there's currently a kind of a gray area that you can tweak with these extensions and the FISPs. I don't know, Raul, if you want to add to that at all.
Yeah, so once your building is classified safe, you put your shed, and then what happens is that the penalties are lower than the actual cost of the work. So a lot of owners may decide to just take the penalty, or and then these penalties accumulate every month. Sometimes if you don't file the fees extensions, but even so, like they're not going to be equal to the amount of the work, right? These facade projects, they're significant because of the mobilization, the shed, permits, everything that gets into it. So unfortunately, yes, the penalties are not are paid, and then the shed stay in place, and some owners let these repairs linger for considerable amount of time. So the fact that the city is looking into getting the sheds down, and they're also proposing not only penalties, but they're trying to apparently approve a loan program or some sort of incentives, which is great. May help the owners to really address the issues in a faster manner. What I think is also important to quote is that a lot of times the owners are not presented with many options, right? Like once they hear it's unsafe, they think, oh my God, like I have to like do everything. And a lot of it is worth exploring that the fees is not unsafe only. There is something between called SWARM. SWARM states for safe with a maintenance and repair program. So what this means is that you have a middle ground, right? You don't have to go from unsafe to safe if you cannot afford it, right? Mm-hmm. You could get from unsafe to SWARM and buy yourself some time, right? Like at that point, once you have SWARMs, it means that you need repairs, but in the future, within 2 years, 3 years, it depends on what your professional record advises. But that may be a strategy that may allow you to remove your shed, right? So this is something that the professionals have to explain to the owners. It is ideal to address everything at once, of course, because once you mobilize, the cost mobilization is such that we may want to be able to address everything, and you don't have to mobilize every 2 years, as you mentioned, or every 5 years, or so soon. But if the owners cannot afford to do all the repairs at once, they could take care of the unsafe conditions first, and then file a report with SWARM, and then buy themselves some time until they get to the safe status.
I always have this conversation with people how you don't really see true change implemented until the code enforces it. Unfortunately, that's just how our industry works. So with local law 15, you saw the bird-friendly glazing, and local law 97, people are paying more attention to energy performance. But the reality is with something like 97, if it costs $2 million to upgrade your windows, but a $60,000 fine, there's going to be a lot of owners that are going to opt to just pay the fine. But with bird-friendly glazing, it's hard for an owner to justify or see that ROI. And then if they have, double-hung windows that have a little whistling or air infiltration, sometimes it's a tough sell to get them to replace it. But when you're actually talking about a structural life safety issue and all the liability and insurance that goes along with that, what does that conversation look like with some of your clients? And do you get a lot of pushback as the doctors?
All the time. All the time. I think that's where we really, we like to use our technology as our tool, because what we found in the past is that the QEs and the facade inspectors are not necessarily communicating to the client the most critical versus the long-term issues, right? I mean, when we come across a client who has a decent budget, then our goal is to make sure that we can fix their building for at least the next 10 years. And then they don't have to, the next cycle, we know it's going to be safe. Maybe it's swamp in the worst case. But when you come to a client that has a low budget, then what we typically do is we go through and we provide them with the analysis that we've done through the laser scanning, through the BIM, through the drones, through other non-destructive testing, for example, too. When Raul was talking about the evolution of the process where you've got just visual inspections from binoculars and photos, that can show you there's a crack, but it's not allowing you to sort of see into the building and see, okay, is that crack allowing water in, which is now getting to a structural element, which is now rusting the steel of the lintel, which is now, potentially compromising a floor plate or something. So when you get into that nitty gritty data that you provide the client with, what we like to do is before we even file the FISP, we try to do it with enough time where we can give them a physical conditions report, basically, and we go through and we say, like, these items are unsafe, these items are swarm, these items are good, but like if you're mobilized and you have the budget, maybe you want to address them now, like window gaskets or something. Or like if you have a lot of money and you want to replace your windows now, then you'll be ahead of the game for local I-97. So having those conversations early on and showing the client like the graphics and the data, like we can tell you with our laser scan, this is a vertical plane and your building is 20 degrees off. You've got a bow in your wall, where when you're looking at a photo, one could argue that it's the perspective or something. But when you're cutting a section through the building and you're showing them significantly, my brick curtain wall or, my brick cavity wall is like got a belly, then they can see it and they can understand, yeah, that looks dangerous. And then they can help prioritize the issues. Then you go through and you say your 5-year budget's this, your 10-year budget's this. And then that really allows them to make an informed decision and see, meet with the board, understand what they're going through, get pricing from contractors, and then decide what are we going to do now in this emergency, and then what are we going to file differently with an amended report, a subsequent report, things like that.
Yes, this reminds me of we had a church project near Washington Square Park, and it was a beautiful building. It was a church converted into condominiums, very, very unique. And so it had 4 spires, and the spires, we found out that one of the spires was leaning. You could see it with the photographs from the ground. We could see that there was certain inclination. The stones it was made out of marble. The marble was eroded. The joints were gone, spoiling mortar throughout. And we presented the photos to the client, and the client said, well, it's been like that for how many years? It's been that for like
200 years. I don't care.
The building is 120 years old, so we had to do the analysis. The analysis, we're allowed, we laser scan the building, we determine that degree of inclination, and we created the graphics that will educate the client to say, well, it's leaning these many degrees. It's above your main entrance. Do you want to wait?
Mm-hmm.
So having all these tools really help to ease the transition of communication with the client, because it's never, no one wants to hear that you have to maintain your building. But unfortunately, buildings are like people, right? We go to the doctor at least once a year, hopefully. Buildings need to be maintained, and that's something that owners and managers have to be ready for. And sometimes it's better to know and be informed and prepare, so it doesn't come as a surprise and an emergency. You avoid that pressure.
Would you say more your clients are proactive or reactive? Meaning, I think there's a primary challenge just right now. I think the DOB is stressed in terms of limited resources and staff, in terms of enforcing a lot of these policies and going around doing these inspections. So do you have clients that come to you asking, what do the next 20 years look like for me? Or do they wait till they get that fine in the mail and then they go, through the white books and see who can take care of this?
So
I think it's like 50-50,
It depends on the ownership. Residential clients will tend to act more on this emergency base. But commercial clients or institutional clients are going to own the building for forever. They do want to know. They do want to know how to address these issues. They're thinking maybe in like long term phase, right? Like there's a residential environment is like more emergency based. Industrial commercial is like longer term, and they're really looking to understanding the issues. That's what we've seen. Would you agree, Hannah?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I feel like there's also certain management companies and things as well that maybe have been around longer or just kind of seen more of this life cycle of FISP that are aware of it, and they understand the concept of, assessments and things where they may be on board with the emergency, but then they see the value once they've been presented with the appropriate information of a 5, 10, and a 15-year plan. Then they say, okay, well, right now, obviously, we have to address this emergency, but knowing that 10 years down the line, we might have to do this, then they can proactively do assessments for the shareholders and save up, so that then the next 5-year cycle, for example, they are already aware they're going to have to do repairs. So they've saved up the money, and then they do a larger program where they can then encapsulate, a plan to get them to safe status for at least 2 cycles. it's hard to project out further than that because of what Raul mentioned, Mother Nature. You know, you've got freeze-thaw cycles, you've got, now we have hurricanes in New York, which like, yes, technically it was always possible, but like we didn't actually see them happen. So so there's new insights, and telling someone your building's going to be safe for 10 years is basically impossible. But you can get them to a very high level of certainty that you're not going to have to do gigantic repairs, but it all comes with them having that information to save up for it.
I don't want to scare everybody. I want to sort of generate awareness. I think as an engineer, the way we design systems, historically or typically, engineers are so conservative that they have such a large built-in factor of safety that the actual failure of the system design is so rare. A lot of the time, it's just poor execution on site or in the field. Do you guys worry about the existing infrastructure? I mean, is this something that you talk to people about outside of the industry? Do you think we have an underlying issue, or do you feel like we're getting a better control of things?
When you're talking about infrastructure, are you meaning like individual buildings or like the city infrastructure as a whole, or both? Both.
Whatever direction you want to
go. Me personally, coming from and growing up in Florida where there's hurricanes, I remember when we first moved here, it fascinated me that all of the mechanical systems were in the basement. To me, that was just like out of my realm of understanding why you would put things in the basement. And I remember actually I had a job at an architecture and an engineering firm, and I asked them that, and they're like, because it's the most protected, you don't have issues with like snow loads, you don't have all these things. It's like inside, we know it's not a conditioned space, but like the sub basement is a fantastic place to put a boiler. And that same firm was where I worked when Hurricane Sandy hit, and the office was directly next to the tunnel going like at Wall Street, the Battery Park Tunnel. And I remember being at home watching the news, watching the tunnel get flooded. My office was next door, and sure enough, like we get a phone call at like 12:30 at night saying office is closed like indefinitely. The oil tank, but like unconnected, flooded the entire building. They had to shut everything down. And I was just like, didn't I say this 2 days ago? So things like that are very interesting. But at the same time, when you consider the amazing geotechnical properties of New York, of how it's on top of this huge layer of bedrock, that's why the buildings are so strong, why it's not necessarily sinking on a regular basis. So I think that there is infrastructure upgrades needed. You know, we have a lot of things underground, but I don't necessarily think that it's something that can't be resolved. I think that new building construction, retrofits can happen to move these things, because it's not per se a structural concern. It's more of a location of generators and boilers and infrastructure. Because when you think about even in Florida, like what's the solution to hurricanes? All the buildings are raised up above the floodplain. You just have a sacrificial layer where, yeah, I mean, maybe your car floats away, but at least your house is still fine because it's on the second floor.
Yeah, I didn't want to go in this direction. I was at dinner the other night, shout out, he'll listen to this, and he thinks, you know, half the coastal cities will be underwater in a couple decades. You know, that's a whole nother thing in terms of flood mitigation and design, especially somewhere like in downtown Manhattan, heavily taken into consideration early on in the design stage.
Yeah, I wanted to, Hannah mentioned a little bit about the buildings infrastructure, but as far as the city's infrastructure as well, like all these changes on weather are making these moves faster, right? Like they're pushing us to really think into it and see like, okay, like where are we going to be in 5-10 years? And the reality is like, I don't know if anyone knows, like weather forecast, like they cannot predict the 100-year rainstorm, like it's not what it is now, right? We have surpassed all the records, but we have to acknowledge that we need to improve. Like buildings need to improve. Engineers definitely do a great job with it. But in terms of the city, our drainage has been designed many years ago. And in the news, we see every day, every time the storm comes, there is like floods on the main highways of the city, right? FDR it's flooded like a lot of time. West Side Highway, same thing. So, and then we have to evaluate the city's response to these issues. I think they do a great job. But we have failure of drainage in some projects where like they are affecting the foundation of the buildings. So I think we need to find a way where professionals and the city work together and try to communicate so these decisions, these improvements are expedited. We can definitely inform the city and tell them where do we find issues, right? We have buildings affected by infiltration due to broken main lines. And sometimes the response takes some time, it takes some time. So I think we need to find a way that the communication is improved, so the response time is not so delayed, and we can be responding to the challenges of new challenges of nature in a quicker way, which is required.
Go ahead, Anna.
The technology side of it too. I mean, we have, like now, if you, for example, are a building and there's a new construction going on next to you, you can install vibration monitors, you can have crack monitors. There's an entire map of underground streams in New York City that go through buildings and everything. So the monitoring, the documentation and tracking of a building's changes over time is another way to really have, instead of an anecdotal, hey, I see a crack, or like I feel some vibration, to have the data to say, this column has moved X percentage, X millimeters. Something like millimeters doesn't sound like a lot, but like over time, if it's happening exponentially faster, that's a red flag that you should do something about it. So with the technology, with the laser scanning, with crack vibration, all these monitoring tools that we have, we can get snapshots of the building at X moment in time, and then continually do that to see if there's changes.
Well, if you study to go back to maintenance and how the evolution of the architecture, if you study curtain wall technology, especially from the 70s to today, they didn't know at the time that a lot of components that had to be replaced, sealant joints, gaskets, are not exposed at the moment. So it's difficult to get to some of those underlying conditions, where today with design, there's a lot of thought put onto maintainability over time. If you look at the architecture from the 70s, 80s, and now the 2010s, 20s, in terms of your traditional hand-laid brick or cavity wall construction, do you think more time and effort is put into maintenance or intentionality around the design?
Definitely. I think with time, we have learned of our failures, and there is definitely and also, it's not only the design, but the people that are building these buildings, right? It's because it's a process. I believe the construction is a process. First, the industry comes with new materials, and then we have to educate the labor industry that is actually putting these things together. We find a lot of failures because it's just the craft that it was not there at the time. With time, cavity wall has evolved. A lot of builders did not put wall ties, at the initial cavity walls. So they felt that now that is standard in the industry, and the people that are actually doing the work understand the need for them. So I think it's definitely it takes time. It takes time, but it's improving. We definitely see a positive impact. It just takes a period of time from learning from the professionals to communicate the importance of the design decisions to the people that are actually building, the industry, and having the professionals being very involved during the construction phase. It's critical, right? It's not enough to just do the design specifications and then hand it to someone else that is going to be doing the construction, but having that communication, the constant contact. DOB has special inspections for that reason, right? Because there were a lot of times where professionals maybe were like specifying how to do the work, laying out the road, but things were not followed. So, having an involvement of the professionals during construction is key to expedite the learning process of the industry.
Well, I'll say, and kudos to LinkedIn and learning from other comments, because I was really kind of corrected on this. I was making fun of a detail that I saw, and a little hard on architects for still specifying a certain type of glazing. And somebody raised the point that architects aren't necessarily expected to be specialists in every single area. They have to know about, it's hard for me to grasp. They do the glazing and then the brick and the waterproofing and the interiors and the mechanical. It's a lot to know. So it makes sense to me to have these facade specialists be able to chime in and explain a different way of assembling or detailing your perfect wall.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's even interesting too, like if you're looking at just like the simple process of DOB filings, for example, when there's there's a whole special section of alternative materials that both have to be proven prior to approval. You have to go through another level of proving to the Department of Buildings, this is a new type of system that I'm designing, and provide data and backup of your mock-ups and your calculations and how you can say that this alternative material meets the building code, and then likewise having that be a special additional inspection. So in our case, we're kind of investigating older buildings and figuring out what happened. But if you are proposing a new system, there is a higher level of involvement with the Department of Buildings, where there are code inspectors reviewing your drawings and everything from the beginning to make sure that it's done appropriately.
So I want to get into Hannah's area now, and I'm not as well informed about this around the technology and the advent of stuff like laser scanning and drones and how that's going to help us better monitor buildings and make more informed decisions. So when did that really gain traction? I've heard some kind of rumblings of issues in terms of utilization of drones in certain areas or regions and what's appropriate or acceptable or not. So what have you seen come in the past few years?
So, laser scanning itself has been around for a while. It originally sort of started more on the civil level, because when you're talking about doing a site survey and there's not really any major landmarks, it's very difficult to kind of grasp, or the scale also, like you can't really have somebody with a tape measure measuring it, so that's where I think it really gained traction. I coincidentally, my dad bought a laser scanner 20 years ago for whatever reason, and I got into it early on. He, not whatever reason, he did it because he was a contractor, and he did also restorations and additions, and so he would need to put in like a new modern stair, for example, into an old building that he needed to really see what's the floor levels and everything. But from our side of things, we started using laser scanners, I think 15 or so years ago. And the laser scanners themselves, there was sort of some controversy, like it's never as good as a person, there. I even questioned it at the time when we first started. I would measure something in the building just so that I could confirm that the laser scan, the point cloud that I got out of it, was in fact what I measured by hand.
Or could you argue that it would be more accurate and you'd eliminate that human error?
Yeah, it's more accurate. But 15 years ago, it was like nothing as good as me, right? Kind of conversation. So we would test it, we would check it out. And then over time we realized there is nothing more accurate. Like when you're measuring something by hand, you always miss something, you always forget something, you have to go back to the site. These, you're getting point clouds, you're getting 360 photos, you're immersed in the space. You can tag things, you can call things out from the point cloud. And then you can even take it into, whatever is your building information modeling tool, like Revit or, the SketchUp, Rhino, millions of different options that you can use there. But it's highly accurate. And then now the next level of it is the photogrammetry and the drones and everything. And that's even more fascinating because likewise, when I started hearing about photogrammetry, I'm like, how can a picture be accurate? It makes it's totally impossible. But we've been testing it on our end in the context of restoration and terracotta or stone, or these segments that are failing, and you have to figure out how, what are we doing? What's the issue? Are we going to replace it? Are we going to restore it? Are we traditionally you have to take that stone off and go bring it somewhere and mold it and figure out how you're gonna fix it. But what we've started testing on that aspect is really trying to cut down your timeline and how you fix the building, because that taking the stone off, one, it exposes the building, right? Now you've got a big hole in it. You do still have to take the stone off eventually, because you have to figure out the structure behind it and how to hook it on. But that's, I think it's like a 4-month timeline right now, 4 to 6 months to get like a new stone or terracotta piece fabricated, which is crazy when you're talking about a project that maybe takes that long. So to be able to get those drones in there and kind of see and get around, even in the inspection process, right? Like Raul's using them on a day-to-day basis for his inspections, going in and really getting up close to something, like we're doing these hands-on inspections, which you can't get rid of right now. There's some jurisdictions that may allow it. New York City still is not allowing it, because you have to actually hit, like physically touch and hit and sound the stones. So you still have to do that. But if you're up on a boom lift, that's giving you maybe 20 feet of space that you can kind of get around. But there's still spaces in between, right? Because like Raul said, it's every 60 feet. So if you do the hands-on inspection as deemed appropriate, but then you see a situation 20 feet away that I can't reach, I can get the drone up there and be up close and personal with the building and really understand what's happening there. See, is that visual condition similar to the physical condition that I touched, and then have a much better idea of the scope of repairs, of what you need to mark in your drawings, even through construction, as-built documentation of what you had in your original drawings versus what is being repaired. Because inevitably, when you're talking about a 100-year-old building that was built with unknown construction at the time, you're going to have issues where you take out a width of brick and then you find out that the backup brick is crumbling, for example. I mean, it's happened.
Is there something that a laser scan would be able to disclose that could potentially eliminate the need for physical sounding?
I don't believe so. I think that it could give you an inclination of something like when you see like a physical issue, like a bulging and things, but all of those things do sort of recede at a certain point, right? They come back to the sound area. So I think that the physical examination of maybe the perimeter of the area that's obvious with the laser scan is still needed, but it does allow you to get the idea of that prior to mobilization, whereas otherwise you need to be mobilized and have your probes open and everything to really figure it out.
I believe it's a matter of time where we want to see. I mean, right now we're seeing window washing maybe done with drones, right? So I think it's a matter of time where we will see drones with the capacity of sounding things, whether like physically or through like sound waves, or it's gonna be that's where we probably will be in a few years. Right now, the drones are used for, as Hannah said, initial reviews. Drones can also do laser scanning now, can do infrared imaging, and so the speed of technology is we're positive about it. We're very optimistic about it. I think it's going to definitely help fight all these new challenges. Something I wanted to mention on the world of FISP, you do not need to have the physical review if your building is unsafe. So if you deem that your building is unsafe, you could come up with a good strategy using the drones or just visually, and then you do save, the actual mobilization. That's the only instance where you don't need the hands-on, because you are accepting that you're unsafe. So you're already taking the hit for it, but it does save some time on that aspect.
Well, what happens? So a firm comes in, a design professional comes in 2016 and does a full facade inspection and deems the building safe. What does that owner think or have in his mind now? I'm good for 10 years. I'm good for 20 years. There's no need. I mean, aren't there other underlying issues that could compound that weren't potentially overlooked or hadn't been seen at the time?
So that's a great question. That's the importance of having the accurate data, right? Like you gotta have the accurate data. This is why we starting integrating things as like, you know, our portal and Beam, because, and we're trying to share this information with the client, because unfortunately we see that in the forensic industry, clients tend to switch professionals between cycles. So when you switch professionals, you know, all your records, it's like switching doctors, you know, all your records are lost. So having all these records, you know, your old plans from your projects were gone. You're lucky if they give you as-builts sometimes, right? So you don't really know what they did in your building. All you know is that you got to save. How did you get to save? You don't know. You know, the clients don't know unless they really have these records. And then the idea will be to transfer these records to the next professional if you decide to change professionals. Hopefully you don't. But yes, in their minds, the clients believe they will be safe forever. That should be the case, Adrian. That should be the case, that once you are investing into fixing your building and you're getting to save, it means you shouldn't be doing work for at least 10 years, you know. Now, how was the work done? That's the issue, right?
Well, and how was the original study done too? Because a lot of times, depending on your professional that you hire, some of them are doing the bare minimum of the FISP, right? They're looking at safety, but they're not asking for things like the building history. They're not asking for if there is infiltration issues, if you have tenants or shareholders that are complaining about, oh, my apartment's really cold by this window, or like my floor is buckling, what's going on? It's not giving like a full holistic review. So yes, it might be safe, and what happens in those instances where there wasn't a review of other underlying conditions, right? Then they end up having to get repairs every 5 years. They're safe, and then the next cycle they're unsafe, and they're like, how did this happen? And you're like, well, did anybody ever ask you about the leak that was on the roof? You know, that leak then trickled down through the wall, and now you have a bulging lintel, and now you're unsafe. But if it was looked at from the beginning in that manner of, you know, using the technology, using the infrared, using the laser scans, using the drones, and knowing, using ultrasound, even like Raul mentioned, that you can say, all right, your building is safe right now, but I can see you might have an issue with water infiltration. So you should address this now. Even though it's safe, it's going to prevent you from being unsafe 5 years from now.
All right, so this conversation went way quicker than I was expecting. It was actually quite enjoyable. But before I wrap up, I actually do have one kind of hypothetical question for you guys to propose. What is one thing as of late that came to you as a surprise during either a forensic study or a building investigation that you wish you could communicate? Maybe this one existing client understands the ramifications or significance, but to that building owner that doesn't want to see the doctor, doesn't want to hear it, you know, how do you kind of convince them, you know what, take that consult, just hear us out, or let us check out your building? These things might come to surprise for you because it came to surprise for us.
That is a good question. Raul, I mean, I have a couple that come to mind, but I don't know if Raul, you
can start then.
So, I mean, I have this one. This one's actually pretty funny because, like I mentioned, I came from this BIM world. So I was always immersed more in like documents and specs and data. And then when we started the company, my first restoration project was we were originally called there because the client could clearly see there was like a crack in the parapet. And we went there, we addressed it. We're like, yes, it wasn't even a FISP. It was just a proactive client who saw that this was a concern. It was like a 4-story tall building. So we went there, we figured out, you know, that there had been moisture infiltration. There had been, and there was, we designed a whole regular like brick masonry facade repair, right? Because it was covered with stucco. We could see clearly from the inside of the parapet that it was brick masonry. We get there, we take off all of the stucco, all of the plaster, all the lath, everything, and come to find out it's a completely different construction type. It's actually built with these like giant stone columns that are creating the, you know, like lintels and stone columns and everything. And then it had brick infill. It was an old industrial building. It was down by the Fashion Institute, and it was just like this. Nobody knew. We took off the stucco, and it was like this completely different face. And then also where the brick was, we took off the first width of brick. We knew we had to repair that, and then the contractor calls us on the video, and he's literally using like a paintbrush and sweeping away the second width of brick, and we're just like, oh my God, this is gonna fall out. And it's funny because I call Raul and I'm like, of all the projects, that's my first facade project. I was like, I gotta back off of this one. Like, I need you to come in and take
Stay
over.
out of this world.
Yeah, and it's just it happens, like building owners, unless they built the building, they really don't know what they have. So now this owner is equipped with this information. He's got a 3D model. He knows exactly how the building is built and how it was repaired, and he knows how to address it in the future. But it's just like it was insane. I wasn't expecting that, and I think it happens more often than not.
Yeah, I was going to say that that is a great question, because practicing architecture as a forensic architect, there is no day or no minute that is not a surprise. It's always a surprise. You don't know what you're going to find. You do have all this technology to analyze the building, but you won't really be certain until you start taking things down and really find. We have found anything. We have found, beer cans instead of bricks from like 1990s. We see newspapers. We can really see the history of New York once we start opening these walls, and it is an exciting surprise. We enjoy it, and then the surprise is also that that as bad as the news are at the beginning with the clients, we all have good intentions, and we all want to keep the city safe at the end of the day. And clients, if they're presenting the facts, even the worst client, or I think the person you think they're not going to do anything, they will understand that. They will understand that, okay, it's time to act. So that is honestly not construction related, but it's also like a pleasant surprise that we all live in this city, and we all understand that we have to work together towards keeping it safe. And
Sure. All right. Well, thank you both for coming on. I really enjoyed this. What's the best way to get a hold of you guys if anybody's interested in a consult with the doctor or just wants to pick your brain?
Just reach out, email us. I think is probably the best. It's Hannah or Raul at Mayta+Sebastian.com is your best bet. We try to be really active and respond to everybody right away.
Awesome. Thank you both for coming on. This was great.
Thank you for having us. Super fun.